Hi, my name is Truette. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 6, which is internal combustion engines. On motorcycles and ATVs, you generally find two types of internal combustion engines, 2 strokes and 4 strokes. Our demonstration unit today is a 1984 Honda ATC 200. This is a 4-stroke engine. And we're going to look into valve clearance inspection and why that's important and how that fits into our Chapter 6. This is a basic diagram of a overhead cam 4-stroke engine. When we're talking about the valves do 2 things. They let fresh air in from the carburetor side, and they let the burned exhaust gas out of the exhaust port. And you think about the valves as kind of gates. They have to open and close in order for these processes to work right for the engine to run. The service processes are critical, especially valve inspection and valve clearances. So doing this without a service manual is really not recommended. The service manual I have is a PDF version that you can download for a fee off the internet. Some places you can find them for free. The quality on this is pretty good, so we're able to see the pictures and the demonstration through the service manual. We really use the service specs for the valve clearance inspection numbers, which show up throughout the procedure, and it gives you a step-by-step view of how to do that. We're going to refer to the service manual mainly just to get the specs, as here shortly I'm going to show you how to get down to the valves and how to inspect those and how to set the clearances. Okay, we're going to get started by removing the seat and the gas tank. We've got to get down to the top of the valve covers in order to be able to get in there to inspect the valve clearances. I've already got all this stuff loose just for time's sake, saving time's sake. So we're going to go ahead and pull the seat off. Next, gas tank. With the gas tank, you usually have a fuel line that you'll have to disconnect, as well as some bolts at the rear, also at the front. Those are already out, so I'm just going to pull this gas tank right off. Okay, and underneath the gas tank, we can finally have enough room to work with our valves. The valve at the front of the engine is going to be the exhaust side. The valves at the back side of the engine are going to be your intake valves. Okay. This particular engine only has 2 valves, 1 intake and 1 exhaust. Okay. We're going to remove the valve inspection covers, just these small round caps. You have one over the top of each valve. Normally they're not finger tight. Like I said, I've already gone through and loosened these with a wrench. Okay, so now that exposes the area that we can use to insert our feeler gauge. Now the feeler gauge we covered in Chapter 3 on our tools and equipment chapter. So should be familiar with that. And we'll get the feeler gauge out here shortly, and we'll go in and get a close-up view of where to insert the feeler gauge and make sure we have the right valve clearance. Now you may be wondering why valve clearances are important. Well, valve clearances are engineered into the design of the engine to allow for heat expansion of the metal parts. As the engine runs, it heats up. With the cooling effect of the air, the engine cools down. So you have expanding and contracting continually going on with these metal parts inside. So they have to engineer a certain amount of clearance or tolerance in there for those valve tips to expand in order to maintain the right amount of clearance throughout all operating temperatures. That's important for performance. It's important for the longevity of the engine, and that's why you'll find it on a service schedule to be done at a routine interval throughout the life of the engine or the motorcycle. So that's why we are here today to look at how to do that, how to do it properly, make sure you're using the right specs, because all those are very critical in maintaining proper valve clearance. Okay, we mentioned feeler gauges earlier. This is a set of feeler gauges we'll be using to inspect our valve clearances. They're just thin blades of metal and they're various thicknesses. Depending on what your service manual specifies, there is a number on each of these blades etched in there so that you can read it and match it up with the one that you need. We're going to go into our service manual next and take a look at how to find the spec and how to match it up on your feeler gauge to make sure you've got the right spec. Okay, finding service specs in any modern manual is pretty easy. They lay these out real nice. They have sections and subcategories and everything that details this in whatever information you need pretty easily. What we're doing today, we're going to be in the maintenance section, which in the table of contents is the third one down. Specifically under the maintenance, we're looking at valve clearance, and so it lays the procedure out step by step. First thing we want to find is the valve clearance specification, which shows up on the next page. Having all this stuff laid out at your fingertips before you actually start the procedure is going to save you time in a shop, which in the end is going to make you a little extra money. Time is money in a shop, depending on how you get paid, whether it's flat rate or hourly or combination. But having your tools, having your specs organized is going to help you in the long run. So our spec range for today is going to be intake valve at 0.05, exhaust valve also at 0.05. Now that's not real common to have both intake and exhaust valve the same, but for our purposes today that makes it nice and easy. And next I'll show you how to select the correct feeler gauge for that spec range. Okay, when you're selecting the right feeler gauge blade for your procedure, you can see two sets of numbers on there. The top one is your standard measurement. Your bottom one is the metric measurement. And make sure you know which spec you're looking at. That way, if you're measuring with the standard clearance, you're going to have to make sure that the spec range that you're looking at accommodates that number. Ours is a metric measurement, so our book said it was the 0.05 millimeter. So we're going to go take a look here through these. This is the smallest one in the group, 0.038. You can find your 0.051, 0.076. So there's the feeler gauge, the blade that we're going to use. Okay, now in our book, in Chapter 6, on 115, Figure 6.9, this is a sideways cutaway of what we're going to see on this engine. On the motor itself, it's kind of cramped and crowded, so you don't get a real clear view of actually what's going on in the area where you're trying to insert the feeler gauge. But what they're showing you here, this would be the valve cap that we removed earlier. This is the valve opening device, your rocker arm. This is a screw and lock nut design, meaning that the way that you add or take away clearance from the top of the valve is to use the adjusting screw and locking it in with the lock nut. Where you're going to measure your clearance is at the very top of the valve, underneath the adjusting screw. Okay, so you have a very small area right here where we're going to try to fit our feeler gauge. So you can see in the next clip where we're going to be inserting the feeler gauge, and you'll see how kind of cramped and crowded it is to do this on the engine. Okay, we're starting from the right side of the engine. That's the side that the valves are more closely situated to, easier to access. So we're going to start on the back side of the head valve cover with the intake valve, and you can kind of see the screw head, the adjusting screw right down there, and the lock nut right around it. Okay, now, there's not a lot of room to work down there, but we're going to get our feeler gauge underneath the adjusting screw and check our clearance, make sure we're in the right spec range, and if not, we'll be able to adjust that. And if you have a decent amount of clearance, we're just going to leave it alone and move on to the next valve. Okay, when you're checking valves with your feeler gauge, and if you've never done it before, you don't really know how much tension you want on that blade going in between the top of the valve and the bottom side of the screw adjuster. What I like to do is just use a go or a no-go method. That's what it's called. And where you select the feeler gauge in the range that you want to use, you'll take the size above it and the size below it. And what you want to happen is you want the size that you've selected for your spec range to go. You want it to fit. You want the size above it, the thicker gauge. You don't want that to be able to fit in there. So the clearance there needs to be close enough to this where it won't allow the next size gauge up to go in. Okay? And then the one below it should fit with relative ease. You can also insert it in and make sure that you just have a light drag on there. Now this is it's a feel thing, so the more you do it, the more of the feel that you'll have for the right clearance. Okay, and it's practicing. You're going to do it over and over. That's part of the reason we're exposing you to this and the activity in the shop, to get you a baseline knowledge of the feel for this procedure, because it's something you're going to do a lot. It's not something that you'll do once in a while. It's something that comes up regularly. Okay. Now going by the service manual details, the next step is going to be to remove the spark plug cap, the spark plug, and the inspection cover, the inspection timing cover right here on the flywheel side. So I've done that, and what that does is that's going to allow us to move the piston to top dead center, and that is the position that we want the piston in order to be able to check the clearances properly. Okay, so that's been set, and that's simply done by watching the timing marks inside here, how they line up with the indicator. Also, when you have the spark plug removed, you can watch the position of the piston and how it rises and falls. See if I can get some light in there. And you can see the top of the piston right there. And one more thing you can check, just to make sure you're at top dead center, is that if there are any clearance in the valves, you'll be able to wiggle those valves just a little bit, or the rocker arms. You can kind of hear that one clicking a little bit. So next, I will get in there and show you where to place the feeler gauge. Okay, so now we're going to get into the placement of the feeler gauge. We're on the intake valve side. We got to go underneath the adjusting screw and on top of the valve tip. So this feeler gauge is already pre-bent at an angle, so it's a little easier to work in this confined area. So we're going to slide in from the side of the feeler gauge underneath there and then drag it back out to see if we've got enough drag on there to call it good. And that feeler gauge fits under there pretty easily. Passes through there pretty easy. And there's a decent amount of drag on there. So that valve we're going to call good. Let's come around to the exhaust side on the front over here. We're going to slide it in the same way. Just kind of guide it in with your other finger. Okay. And that one's just a hair loose. So what I'm going to do is take my 10mm box-in wrench. I'm going to loosen the lock nut. Just like that. Okay. You also saw the adjusting screw loosen a little bit. We're going to take our 90-degree flat blade. We're going to give that just a little twist. The whole time monitoring how much drag you've got on that feeler gauge. Okay, so I'm going to pull my screwdriver off the top so I'm not pushing that down. Okay, you can see there's quite a bit more drag on there than there was, and that's what we're after. We wanted to take up a little bit of clearance. I might have taken out too much, so we're going to back that adjusting screw out just a hair. And believe it or not, on these screws, a hair is a big difference. And I just messed that up. Okay, so we're in there now. Pretty much at the clearance we need to be. So I'm going to, there we go. I'm going to put my 90-degree flat blade back on there, and I'm going to hold that adjusting screw. Get that cable out of the way. Hold that adjusting screw while I tighten that lock nut. So you don't really want that clearance to change, otherwise you're going to be loosening that lock nut going back in and readjusting that clearance. Okay, we're going to torque that lock nut also. Final check. And that might be just a little bit too tight. So we're going to repeat that process. Just take that lock nut loose. I'm going to reinsert the feeler gauge so we can monitor how much clearance we have in there. There's not a lot of room to work, so you just kind of have to do what works best for you. Depending on the application, some of these engines have more room to work, some of them have less room to work, believe it or not. So I'm going to leave my feeler gauge hanging just like that. I'm going to put just a degree or two more of a turn on that screw. Okay, leave that in place. Take your screwdriver and your box end wrench. Tighten that. And recheck our clearance. Okay, that feels a lot better. Okay, and that's it. Now if this was a multiple, if you had more than just 2 valves per engine, you would repeat the same process for each rocker arm, but for the 2-valve engine, that's all we've got. We're going to go ahead and get the torque wrench and torque those down, because you don't want those coming loose during engine operation. Alright, we're going to use the service manual again to find the spec for the torque value on the lock nut, and that shows up right after our valve clearance spec. It's the next section right down below it. It tells us that the torque value is 11 to 13 foot-pounds. On our click style torque wrench, I have it already preset. This one in particular is in inch-pounds, so there's a conversion that you have to do, but cover that in our chapter 3 of the tools and equipment section. So we're just going to go in here now, and on top of each lock nut I'm just going to put the torque wrench and give it a little twist, and you'll see the head of the torque wrench slightly break over to indicate that it's torqued properly. Really not going to show up in the video. It's a light breakover on this joint right here, but they are torqued, and that's just to ensure that those lock nuts aren't going to come loose during engine operation. Okay, at this point the valve inspection process is done. All that's left is to reinstall the inspection covers that came off, the valve inspection covers and the timing inspection cover. We'll put our bodywork back on, and that's all there is to it on this engine. There are more complex ones out there, but that'll come as you gain experience in the shop or at further education level. But for our module today, we've been able to look into the process involved, how to use the service manual to find your spec, how to use the service manual to select the torque value. We've also been able to follow the procedure step by step. And in the textbook, we were able to correlate the diagrams with what we were looking at on the engine itself. So thank you for your attention today, and thank you for your time.